Hey, it's Justin, and I want to talk a little bit about interviewing today. Interviewing is one of those things that, you feel like you know how to do. You ask some questions, you get some answers, you kind of talk to others about it, and you decide, yeah, this person sounds pretty interesting, sounds like they've done it before. Maybe you have your own framework of how you think about it. But interviewing is one of the most important things you can do as a leader. Making sure your team is prepared to participate and evaluate candidates is just extremely important in the growth of the company. Now, there's risk in every hire, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But I just think there's not enough attention paid to the hows and some of the methods that you can use in interviewing. So that's what I'm going to spend some time on today. A bit of background: I spent almost 6 years at Amazon. Amazon, in order to interview anybody, has a course called the Making Great Hiring Decisions. It's about a 4-hour course you go through that talks about the hows and the leadership principles. And then in every interview loop at Amazon, you have a bar raiser. This isn't anything secret. It's out there. You can read about bar raisers, but bar raisers are responsible for the overall candidate experience and making sure that the team that is doing the hiring isn't hiring the first person that they can, smile at because they just got to fill that role. That's the basics. I'm not suggesting every company needs a bar raiser or that you even need to mimic a lot of the processes there, but there's a reason that companies like Amazon are so successful. And I've had the benefit of, leading sizable organizations at Amazon, Uber, Material Bank, and most recently in Juniper by IMC. I can tell you overall, not enough attention is paid to the quality of the interview process. So we're going to dive in here and spend a little bit of time, and I'm going to share some of my learnings over the years and some of what I share with my teams in how to have great interviews. So let's talk about what great hiring is. I don't want the unrealistic bar to be set here. There was a study done in one of my previous companies that looked at, what does great look like in hiring? And the reality is that the best of the best interviewers, the folks who hired people that ended up being outstanding a year later when they had their first performance reviews, the people that had the least amount of candidates that a year on after they've been hired failed out of the company for performance reasons, the best of the best are right about 80% of the time. That doesn't seem like a lot, right? 20%, 2 out of every 10 candidates you hire are likely to fail out. But there are things that we can do in the interview to make sure that we're uncovering the best evidence we can to make the best hiring decision. Now, I mentioned a minute ago that there's risk in every single hire, and that's true. There's generally 3 types of risk. First type of risk is risk to the customer. These are folks that are going to interact with your customer. They're going to guide customer-facing areas. If you hire a bad hire there, you may end up having issues with your customers. That's a fairly bad risk to take on. And then there's risks to your team. This is somebody who comes in, they're not a team player. They really disrupt the environment. And that can be pretty disruptive as well. And then finally, there's the financial risk. Financial risk is you go through the hiring process, you spend the time, you spend the effort, you spend 3 months getting somebody ramped up, and they end up not working out. You've wasted all of those company resources and that time, and you'll never get it back. And in some markets, that's pretty impactful. But this is the most tolerable of all the risk. Obviously, we'd want to avoid any risk, but we can't do that. So identifying where the risk lies and what you're going to do to mitigate it when you bring this person on is a critical part of the interviewing process. If you hire somebody that is a great cultural fit, that's learned a lot along the way, but they don't have exactly the tactical or functional experience you're looking for, but they're really close, you might develop a launch plan for this individual that goes through training them exactly the way you see that need filled, where you see those functional skills improved, and make sure that you shore up that risk, just as one example. So the objectives of the next 22 minutes are going to be to talk about 3 effective interviewing techniques, discuss the essentials of interviewing, starting with what I'll call the hiring bar, use behavioral interviewing techniques to assess the technical, the functional, and behavioral competencies. And then you really need to learn how to dive deep and challenge a candidate's performance and challenge their answers. A lot of people think interviewing is about ask the question, it gets answered, write the notes down, you move on. There's a lot of meat there in some of these answers, and you need to learn how to dive into that and ultimately develop confidence in your hiring decisions. So let's talk about the interview loop. Of course, you're familiar with this. You have a phone screen or the initial interview, and you decide, are you going to bring this person in-house or do a video or do a second interview? You really want to understand, do they have the basic skills for the role? Is there anything that stands out? Most of the time, you can teach the recruitment team what you're looking for, what would be a red flag to you, concerns you might want them to dive deeper on in that 30-minute phone screen. But ultimately, the decision is just about whether or not you want to dedicate the time to go through a more formal interview loop. And then the formal interview, does this person raise the bar? We'll talk about what that means. Are they the right person for this role and for the team? And do they have the potential for long-term success? These are the three core things that you need to answer and be prepared to dive in on in an interview. I want to touch on two ineffective interview techniques because they are out there. So traditional interview questions like tell me about yourself, describe your latest job. These are interesting. You may even use these for opening discussion, break the ice with a candidate, but they're not going to tell you anything about performance and behaviors, and they're certainly not going to give you much to dive in on. And then there's the brain teaser questions. Tell me why a manhole cover is round. How many streetlights are there in a square mile? These are funny, they're interesting, but again, not going to give you any kind of tried and true performance evidence that you need to decide, is this person right for your team? So thinking about effective interviewing techniques, there's three, and we're going to focus on the behavioral. There's behavioral, functional, and hypothetical. So the behavioral is most commonly seen by tell me about a time when, give me an example of, and you finish it off with specifics where you want to hear a story. Stories are processed using the probing technique of STAR, or situation, task, action, result. And we'll spend plenty of time of that in the next 20 minutes or so. The functional technical, you're looking for a demonstration of skills. You could see coding on a whiteboard, analyzing a financial statement, or in the sales and customer success, you might have them role play. There may be some place for this. You may have somebody spend 10 minutes on this, especially if it's like a role play in sales or customer success. But it's not the core part of what you go for in getting behavioral-based interviewing. And then hypothetical, you're looking for applied thinking. How would you do X or Y with more or less resources? How would you launch a specific new product? Let's look at this website. How would you improve it? There are places for those. Again, not generally the approach that my teams take and that I take when I'm looking for behavioral-based interviewing. So what are the essentials of interviewing? Number one, understanding where's your bar. Number two, assigned areas by interviewer, the candidate experience, legal and ethical code, how to remain objective, and then the big one, behavioral interviewing and the STAR probing technique. And then the final assessment and using substantiated feedback. So let's dive in. The hiring bar. Is this person better than 50% of the people currently performing in this role? Now, when I teach this course, I get a lot of debate around, well, how do you know who exactly is performing the same role? What if it's a really unique role? And all those are good questions. And this is not a perfect science. But let me tell you what you're going for here. If you constantly hire people that are better than the midpoint, better than the average, then over time, your team is going to raise the overall bar. You're going to systematically improve your team over time. You're not going to always get it right, but you should try for this as the bar. The second part is, does this candidate have upside growth potential to have a long-term impact? Maybe you're hiring for a very specific functional role and you just need that role filled now. In reality, companies' products, strategies change and evolve over time. Competition gets stiffer, financial resources and less, and you've got to have innovative people on the team. So are these people going to be able to keep up with the pace of change and innovation at your company? Now, it's true, there are roles where this doesn't apply. You just need somebody to come in and help out delivering packages. You need somebody to manage the front desk, these types of important roles, but roles that can stay pretty steady over time. But the majority of roles we're talking about are the innovative roles where you're going to need somebody that can improve and step up over time. So assigned areas, you should really prepare, and a lot of people don't do this, prepare for the interview by making sure that, if you have 3 or 4 interviewers, they're not all asking the same questions. Make sure you trust each one of these interviewers, probably by going through a training like this, to deliver the results, deliver the questions, to dive in appropriately and actually have really substantiated feedback by the time you're using their evaluations. So that's step one. Then assign them areas that make sense for the role, for the company, and for the individuals doing the interviewing. So you may have somebody doing functional skills, for example. Do they know how to sell? Have they sold before? Do they know how to handle customer complaints? Give some examples of when they've done this in the past using the behavioral methodology that we'll talk about. Anything you can think of that's functional may be one area in the interview. The second one would be earns trust and culture. And again, these are just examples, but these are pretty common ones. You want to make sure somebody understands, what you're looking for in the culture of the company. And you want to understand what's important to them and what are the environments that they've worked well in. Tell me about a time that you've had a conflict with a coworker. What was it about? How did you resolve it? What was the end result? And we'll talk again about the STAR methodology of processing these examples, but that's a pretty important one. Two other examples, diving deep in data. Is this a role where you need somebody to really understand the ins and outs of the data and understand how to dive in and assess a problem? If you're in sales, look at close rates, look at rejection rates. If you're in customer success, look at the customers that are growing, look at the ones that are not. Try to identify similarities and come up with an idea of how do we grow those customers that are stagnant or potentially attriting from the business. Moves fast in innovation. This is another one of my favorites. Is this somebody who has to have everything perfect? Do they have to understand everything to the nth degree before they make a decision? Or is this somebody that knows the difference between one-way doors and two-way doors, as they say? A one-way door is you walk through it, you lower a price, you run a promotion. It's hard to walk that back without really disrupting your business. But a two-way door is just a test. Test something out, didn't work, go back. Does this person understand that? Can they move fast? And there's a host of other leadership principles or competencies that you can, choose here. But these are the ones that I've just picked for the purpose of this example. The point is make sure that you assign areas so that everybody knows what they're going for in the interview loop. The candidate experience is an important one. You're a customer-facing representative of the company. So let's say that you hire 1 or 2 out of 10 people you interview, or even 1 or 2 out of 5 people you interview. You're talking about a significant portion of your interviewees, of your candidates, coming in, having experience with your company, and then getting rejected. If you do that year after year, quarter after quarter, you don't want a large population of people out there that say that company was terrible, it was a horrible experience, etc. So it's really important to pay attention to this. And I think this is something that's overlooked. I've seen companies where they bring a candidate in, supposed to have 4 interviews. They get through the first one and they say, you know what, this really isn't working out. So we're going to save ourselves both time and, you're gone. That's just an awful experience. If you do right in the phone interview, if you do the screens well, you'll make sure you have a rich experience across the 3 or 4 interviewers. And each one should be able to evaluate the candidate on their own. So I'm not a fan of the stage-based interviews where you get through the first person, you go to the second, you get through the second, go to the third. That's fine in the phone screen. Maybe you have 2 phone screens up front, but once you're getting into you've decided that I want this candidate to go through an interview loop, you want 3 or 4 different perspectives. And I've seen interview loops where, one person was adamantly just against the candidate. It was a terrible interview. I don't want him ever working at this company. And then the other 3 were raving fans. This was amazing. Have that rich discussion. Make sure it's evidence-based. Talk about the questions that you ask, and you'll get a really rich set of feedback to make a decision on as a hiring manager. So a little touch on the legal and ethical code. Obviously, as a company, you're an equal opportunity employer. That's pretty standard, written in most places. So the reality of this is, in the interview, if you're going to ask a question, can you demonstrate a job-related necessity for asking that question? Now, if you're hiring for a factory, if you're hiring for roles where you need somebody to lift 50 pounds, that's fair game. Ask them, can they lift 50 pounds? Can they walk 2 miles in a day? If you're in a warehouse. But if you're doing a phone-based role, it's work from home. You need to ask them about their experience, how they manage their time, certainly the behavioral stuff that we'll talk about. But you don't really need to know how much they lift or their marital status. You don't need to know how many kids they have. It might seem just comfortable to ask, tell me about your family, that kind of stuff, but you can get in trouble that way. So try to steer away from anything that's not necessary. It's not a job-related necessity to ask the question. You want to be personable, but not personal. I've certainly been in interviews where I've had candidates come in and say, oh my gosh, I'm having this and that problem. My wife did that. Like, look, thanks for sharing that. We can't and don't use that in evaluating you for the role. So let's move on. I've got some questions to talk about from a business standpoint, from some of your experience that I'd really like to hear about. And you can kind of move on from that. You want the interviews to be objective. I mentioned a little bit about, you want 3 or 4 independent opinions. So stay objective and don't bias others ahead of the interviews. Don't call somebody after yours and say, hey, you're up next, but man, I got to let you know this. Just don't do it, right? You want everybody to have their own objective outcome for that interview. You're asked to interview and provide your own assessment, so don't group those together before the debrief, however you go about doing the debrief. So the real meat of this, behavioral interviewing, what is it? What is STAR? We got several slides on this here. The premise behind it is that the most accurate predictor of future performance is past performance in similar situations. So that provides the basis of what questions you're going to ask and what answers, hopefully, you're going to hear. Behavioral interviewing questions, they elicit specific examples, and you probe using the STAR methodology to assess the candidate's performance, the how, and the end results. So let's dive into STAR. Up front, the S and the T, the situation and the task. Describe the situation you faced and the context of the story. What task did you decide was necessary to take on based on that situation? That sets the tone for the whole story. Where did this occur? When did it happen? Why is this important? Was this last week or was this 10 years ago? Is this a relevant example? What company was this at? What were y'all trying to achieve that year? These are things you can do to dive in, the questions you can ask to dive in and probe. So what actions did you take? What did you personally own? How did you do it? And who else was involved? If you've ever asked a candidate, tell me about a time you were faced with a difficulty and, what was it and what was the result? You'll get candidates that say, generally when faced with that, here's what we do. And, hopefully by the end of it, the result is clear. It's a really generic answer, right? You want to understand, great. I say sometimes, I love stories. I'm a storyteller myself. So I'd love to hear a story that illustrates what you're talking about. So you said that generally we do this. Tell me about a time when that actually took place. Walk me through it. What was the situation? And sometimes you have to step candidates through it. They say, oh, this was the situation. Here's when it happened. Great. So what did you decide to do? You're literally walking them through the STAR methodology. Interviews are not about gotchas. They should not be about gotchas. You're not wanting to ask the question, and then when the candidate gives you a generalization, make a note. They couldn't tell me a story. Pull it out of them. You've already devoted this much time. Make sure you ask them the question. If you need to step them through STAR, step them through STAR. It makes it really difficult for them to make stuff up when you're asking them to tell a specific story. So what was the result after you understood the situation, the task they chose, the action they took? What was the result? This is an important aspect of this. How did they measure results? Do they measure results? So make sure you get into the results as well. So you want to choose questions that provoke very specific examples of stories, and you can even tell that to a candidate. I want to hear a story. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. So you want to process this example using the STAR methodology. Once you've established the story, probe to dive deeper on an area that you've been assigned. Remember those areas up front. If you're one of the 4 interviewers, what are you trying to dive in on? And maybe ask questions around that. Get clarity, or if you have a concern, ask. We call it peeling the onion. People will give you one layer, but you may want to ask, that sounds really interesting. That's not actually what I would have thought. I would have thought, you would have done X, Y, and Z. Tell me about your decision to take the action you took or the task you chose to take. And if appropriate, feel free to challenge the candidate's statements. Hey, that sounds off. That's weird. I never heard of that. Tell me about that. You want to see them think a little bit on their feet. And you want to understand, are they just making this up? Most of the time they're not. And you should assume they're not. But you do want to dive in and understand a little bit deeper about their questions. So when you think about going through an interview, a lot of people think about, I'm going to walk in with a list of 8 or 10 questions. I hope I can get through them all. I walk in with 3 or 4 questions, and I want to make sure I get to the depth of those 3 or 4 questions that cover my area. And that generally takes the whole time. Now, not the whole time. You want to leave a little bit of balance time at the end for the candidate to ask questions and get something out of the interview, because you want this to be a balanced 2-way conversation. But you should come in prepared with just a few questions that you hope can really drill in, and you can ask and spend a good bit of time on those questions or those situations. So the assessment piece. You're assessing ultimately on their performance, their hard skills. So you want to drill down on their functional expertise there. On the competencies, how did they go about doing it? What did they care about when they were doing it? What did they prioritize? Were there company guiding principles? What kind of, what principles were they living by as they were carrying out this STAR example? And then the results. You want the measures of those accomplishments. So that's it for the basic interview training. If you're a manager just getting started, there are some additional resources out there I want to point you to. My wife, Erin, hosts a wonderful TikTok channel at erinjackson.co. You can check her out at www.erin-jackson.co. And then on Instagram, Erin Jackson Co. and her YouTube channel, Erin Jackson Co. She covers a lot of basics, tactical, management one-on-one. If you're relatively new to the role or if you're aspiring to be a manager. So check them out. Thanks for joining.